In part 1, Shackleton's dream of crossing Antarctica collapsed, along with his ship, which was crushed by the ice. His crew was stranded for over a year, drifting on pack ice, sleeping in tents at -40, and surviving on seal and penguin meat. Now, things get far worse. Forced into open lifeboats, they began a brutal journey across the deadly Weddell Sea, a place so dangerous that even seasoned whalers steered clear of it. Their goal was Elephant Island, uninhabited, remote, and far from any ship's path. It wouldn't be a rescue for them, not even safety really, just land, something they hadn't touched in 497 days. But reaching it was only half the battle, because no one knew they were even there, and no one was coming. What followed was one of the most outrageous survival sagas in polar history, a desperate voyage across nearly 1,300 kilometers or 800 miles of open ocean. A last-ditch mountain crossing over uncharted terrain, and the kind of odds that should have killed them all. Before they ever launched the boats, though, Shackleton's men were already breaking down, along with the ice beneath them. They'd been drifting for weeks on a fragile ice floe, moving camp every time the cracks got too close. The Endurance, their ship, was gone, long gone, rescue wasn't coming, and when the ice finally shattered for good, they had no choice but to run for land. What they didn't know was that on the opposite side of the continent, another group of men was in just as much trouble. The Aurora team, Shackleton's support crew that had been sent to the Ross Sea to lay supplies for the second half of the expedition, but a storm had ripped the ship from its anchorage and left 10 men stranded on shore. And by now, 3 of them were already dead. 2 separate crews, 2 shattered expeditions, and now, on both sides of Antarctica, survival was no longer about glory. It was about staying alive. On April 9th, 1916, the 28 men had been trapped on the ice for more than a year, and their camp was slowly breaking apart. A deep, violent crack split the camp. Shackleton's tent was perched right on the fault line, and one moment he was lying in his sleeping bag, the next he was drifting away on a slab of ice. Chaos erupted, gear was hauled by frozen hands, tents collapsed into slush, and men scrambled to load the lifeboats with sleeping bags, stoves, and whatever hadn't fallen into the ocean. Then came a second shock. The split had carried away one of the boats and most of their food. A few men jumped the widening crack, and slipping and cursing, they shoved the boat back with every ounce of strength they had, which wasn't much at this point. And now they were caught in limbo. If they launched the boats too early, they could be crushed by the drifting ice. And if they waited too long, the ice would collapse beneath them. So Shackleton quietly told them to launch the boats. That was it, the point of no return. They loaded the boats in eerie silence, with their wet gear and soggy rations, no idea what waited ahead. Then all 28 men climbed into 3 boats and pushed off. The ice that they lived on and slept on, fought to survive on, began to splinter behind them, breaking apart and swallowing itself whole. They were now at sea. With the ice behind them, they turned their sights north toward land, any land. There were only 2 possibilities, really: Clarence Island, a narrow piece of land at the far edge of the South Shetland Islands, or Elephant Island, a larger, much more rugged mass to the west. But they were both over 50 miles away, and both were buried in fog. And neither one was very welcoming. Clarence Island was closer, but it was steep, exposed, and known for violent surf. And that's even if they managed to spot the island in the mist. Elephant Island was farther, but wider, more sheltered, and unlike Clarence Island, it had the tiny possibility that someone might spot them. Sealing ships sometimes go by that island. But in the end, it wasn't much of a choice. The wind and the currents were pulling them west anyways, so Shackleton steered for Elephant Island. It was a gamble like everything else out there, but it was the best bad option that they had. The moment the boats hit the water, it was pure chaos. No one had rowed in over a year. Their arms were weak, their timing was off, their fingers barely worked from the cold. Their oars were smacking into each other, hitting the men in the hands and faces. And then there was the modifications to the boats, which didn't help. The size of the boats had been built up for ocean spray, which sounded like a great idea until it was time for rowing, which was really, really difficult. Above them, the sky was exploding with birds, thousands of them, and there were so many they had to duck their heads to avoid getting splattered with bird crap. And then the whales arrived, not just 1 or 2, but dozens, massive shadows moving beneath the surface. humpbacks, orcas, some longer than the boats themselves. One surfaced close enough to send a wall of water right over one of the boats, and everyone held their breath. If a whale surfaced underneath them, they were done. But they got lucky and were able to escape the whales. Shackleton led in the boat called the James Caird. Worsley took on the Dudley Docker, and Hudson was in the smallest and kind of the sketchiest of the three, called the Stancomb Wills. And each boat had problems. The Stancomb Wills was low riding and got swamped constantly. The Dudley Docker was stable but clunky, and it was like rowing a bathtub. And the James Caird, it was the biggest and heaviest of them all. That carried half the party. And they were rowing into the dangerous Drake Passage, which is brutal even on modern ships. This region is notorious for being one of the roughest stretches of water on Earth. Between the Antarctic Peninsula and Cape Horn, there's no landmass to break the wind, so the current just builds and builds. Waves can hit 50 feet high. Clear skies happen maybe 10% of the time, and the rest of the time it was nothing but wind, sleet, fog, and endless gray. And they had to bail water constantly. It was sloshing over the sides, soaking their food and the men. They didn't even have a tarp to huddle under, just wet sleeping bags and stiff canvas sails. And they couldn't even rest. Each hour brought new ice, new waves, and new decisions. Should they tie the boats together? Risk drifting away from each other? Row through the night? So Worsley did what he could, navigating by the stars when the clouds led him. But even that was rare. For most of the journey, they just rode blind, praying they were still heading north, hoping that they wouldn't freeze, capsize, or vanish. And then came the night. They tried to rest by hauling the boats onto a slab of ice just to get a break from the water. But around 2 a.m., a man in his sleeping bag rolled off the edge and into the freezing sea. Shackleton saw it at the last second and ran over and pulled the soaking man in his bag onto the ice. Seconds later, the ice cracked. A massive split opened up right beneath them. If Shackleton had waited a few more seconds to rescue the man, he would have been crushed by the ice. The men that he saved had no dry clothes. Nobody did, really. So they did the only thing they could. They made him walk all night, taking turns holding him up and pacing back and forth on the ice to keep his blood moving. He didn't complain about the cold, but he did whine for hours about losing his tobacco. That's the one thing that they seemed to have a lot of, and the one thing that was helping keeping them sane. By the next day, April 10th, they were finally in open water. They put up the sails and turned toward land. For a few miles, it looked like they might actually make it. But the winds picked up and water poured over the sides of the boats, threatening to swamp them. Shackleton gave the order to turn around. But there was no ice safe enough to camp on, so they tied the boats together and drifted, with no rest again, no food, just gale-force winds ripping snow across their faces. 3 days later, Worsley finally got a break in the clouds. He hauled out his sextant, an old-school navigation tool that measured the angle between the sun and the horizon to figure out your position at sea. It was their only way to know where the hell they were. So he ran the numbers, and he checked again. And his face dropped. 3 days of rowing, fighting, freezing, and they'd been swept backwards. And that's when the morale hit rock bottom. The nights in the boats nearly broke them all. You could just imagine being soaked all the time, freezing, floating around in Antarctic waters, and not sleeping. It's a total nightmare. But some of the men would try and huddle together for warmth, and that didn't even help very much. It was probably about -20 or maybe -4 Fahrenheit, probably colder. It was cold enough that they could hear the water freezing around the hulls of the boats, and their clothes were stiff and frozen. And then the sea anchor failed, and the boats started spinning sideways. They bailed non-stop. The Stancomb Wills was filled with shin-deep water. One man completely cracked, sure that a whale would flip the boat over. Another sat slumped in the corner, tears freezing to his cheeks, and just tried to hide his breakdown. Shackleton watched him silently, though unsure who would survive the night. After 4 days without sleep, things were really, really bad. One of the men's hands were turning black. Percy Blackborough, the stowaway, had lost all feeling in his feet. He'd actually worn the wrong kind of boots, and the doctor said that he'd probably lose his toes or his feet. One man was pulling in the sea anchor when it smacked into his face and shattered his front teeth. Like, could it get any worse? But they kept rowing, because they really had no choice. By 3 a.m., Worsley was barely functioning. He couldn't focus, he couldn't calculate the numbers, he couldn't stay awake, and without him, they had zero chance. He He was like the navigator extraordinaire. By this time, they thought they were pretty close to land, maybe 25 kilometers or 15 miles from Elephant Island. But if they missed it, the current would suck them out to sea. Then, out of the fog, they saw cliffs. Enormous gray walls rising straight out of the sea. It was Elephant Island. There was no celebration, just an overwhelming flood of relief. They finally reached land. Solid, unmoving land for the first time in 497 days. One of the men, called Rickenson, collapsed from a heart attack just as they touched ground. Other men couldn't even stand. Some grabbed fistfuls of stones, acting like they had struck gold. They were so happy to be on land. When they stumbled ashore into this really ragged patch of gravel and rock, there was no beach, no shelter, just wind, stone, and sky. But it was land, and that was enough for now. The sun cracked through the clouds. For the first time in days, they could actually see each other. They'd been huddled in darkness with their faces wrapped and their heads down, too focused on staying alive to even look at each other. And now standing still in full light, it hit them. What they saw was pretty rough. Frostbite had turned their faces pale. Their lips were cracked and raw. Their eyes were sunken, cheeks hollowed, and every man looked decades older than when they started. The cook handed out some boiling hot milk, and some of the men cried as they drank it. They were off the boats, but they were far from safe. The patch of ground they landed on wasn't much more than a tiny gravel shelf at the base of a huge steep cliff. It offered zero protection, and the tides had swept it clean before, and they would do it again. Shackleton told Wild to get back in the boat and scout for a better camping spot along the coast. And a mere 9 hours later, a really long time of scouting and being out on the water again, he was back with news that they'd found a possible spot. It wasn't a very good one, but it was a slightly less deadly spot. It was just a narrow bit of rock jutting out from the foot of a glacier, about 30 meters or 100 feet across, completely exposed. There was no flat ground, but it was much higher ground, and just enough room to pitch a camp. So they made the move. A few of the men were in really, really bad shape. Blackborough's feet were a total disaster and dead pretty much, and Rickenson, the guy who had the heart attack, was still recovering, and he could barely move. Shackleton gave them the only shelter available, which was a lifeboat flipped upside down. The crew packed its sides with snow and muck and draped canvas over the top to block the wind. And it stank of rot and blubber. The ground underneath was wet, uneven, covered in slush and penguin crap, but it was something. And that's when Shackleton told them he was going back to sea. They would never survive on this island. So there were three options. Cape Horn, 800 kilometers or 500 miles northwest, straight into the wind. The other option was the Falklands, a bit further up from Cape Horn, but to the north and against the current. Or South Georgia, 1,300 kilometers or 800 miles northeast. A whopping distance. With the wind and current, though. It was the only realistic option. But even then, the odds were against them. They'd have to hit a tiny target just 40 kilometers or 25 miles wide in the middle of the world's stormiest ocean. And the boat was only 22 feet long. But they had to try. So Shackleton picked his crew carefully. Obviously, he chose Worsley because he's the navigating genius. They would never survive without him. McCarthy was strong and steady and liked by everyone, so he chose him. And then there was Crean. No drama, he was all grit. And Vincent wasn't ideal, but he was physically capable. And McNeish was brilliant with boats, but a bit of a wild card. Shackleton thought he would be too risky to leave behind, though. And he had to be smart, just about not who to take, but who not to leave behind. He didn't want that one person to impact the others negatively. They spent 5 days prepping for launch, patching, reinforcing, sewing ballast bags from frozen canvas, ripping planks from one lifeboat to build a makeshift deck on another. As they were leaving, Shackleton asked the doctor how long could the men left behind survive. And the doctor said maybe a month. And with that, on April 24th, 1916, the James Caird was ready. A canvas deck, a single hatch, weighted with a ton of rocks, ugly but seaworthy. There was no fanfare, no speeches, just 6 men climbing in and shoving off and rowing into the swell. The rest of the men stood on the rocks until the boat disappeared. Their only chance at survival had just rowed into the storm. So while Shackleton's men were carving into a glacier just to survive, my crew over on Patreon will soon be watching me trying to function in minus 40, wrangle a half-feral puppy who's running around here somewhere, and 3 senior huskies, and keep my little cabin in the woods here warm and toasty. If you like stories of survival, chaos, and questionable decision-making in the cold, Shackleton had Antarctica, and I've got the Yukon. It's not a legendary expedition, but if you like survival stories, remote living, and seeing what winter in the Yukon looks like with the crazy pack of dogs, you'll feel right at home. So head on over to Patreon and join up. I've got a link in the description. All right, back to the story. So the men left behind, they didn't say much. They just stared into the ice and tried not to think about the suffering that was to come. The first night was hell. There was sleet, it was cold, and not much of a shelter. By morning, they started chipping into the glacier behind camp, hoping to carve out a bit of a shelter. And it was brutal. The men were starving, they were half frozen, barely functioning. But slowly they made progress, and after a few days, several men could crawl inside at once. But, and I don't know if this is something they just didn't think about because they're running on fumes, but their body heat naturally warmed up the walls, and then the whole glacier above them started melting. Water ran down the walls, pooling under their sleeping bags. Their heat, which was keeping them alive, was destroying their only shelter. They had no choice. They couldn't live in a glacier. So they flipped the lifeboats and dragged these heavy stones across the ice to build foundation walls, which is pretty smart. And they stacked the rocks 4 feet high, laid the boats across, and sealed the gaps with canvas. It wasn't warm, it wasn't dry, but it was something. And the blizzards didn't stop. Winds tore at the canvas and flung snow sideways and soaked everything. They were just pretty much wet 24 hours a day. They patched holes with scraps and they burned blubber to stay warm and killed hundreds and hundreds of penguins to eat. On May 2nd, 8 days after the boat left, the sun finally came out. So they all hauled out their wet bedding and soggy clothes to dry things, and everything went from soaked to merely damp. It was a ridiculous but small victory. That day, they talked more than usual. They were pretty happy. I don't know how they were happy. I would have been so freaking miserable being wet and cold all the time. And seeing the same people, you're around the same people all the time. Just imagine that. You just get so sick of each other. But they all sat around constantly guessing when rescue would arrive. And someone very optimistically said maybe May 12th. But they were wrong by a long shot. And the waiting was only just the beginning. By mid-May, the start of the Antarctic winter, the sea was freezing over. And the men kind of started to panic. If a rescue ship couldn't get through, they might be trapped for a really long time. And that means wintering again in Antarctica. But the doctors were kept busy pulling teeth, cleaning wounds, checking Rickinson's heart. But the biggest concern was Blackburrow's toes. So it was time for surgery. They waited for a warm day, lit the blubber lamps, and prepped for surgery in the cramped shelter. They kicked everyone out, tried to keep it as clean as possible as you can in penguin shit and mud and dirt, and they used chloroform for anesthesia. When the bandages came off, his toes were black and brittle. Macklin, the doctor, quickly worked to remove them. And then he cleaned the wound and stitched it up. And it took only an hour. When Blackburrow woke up, the biggest thing he was concerned about was getting a cigarette. These guys were tougher than tough. Back on the James Caird, Worsley held the boat steady, heading north. The pack ice was too dense to sail, so they dropped the canvas and took up the oars, weaving through slush and sharp ice floes that could shred the boat instantly. For almost an hour, they clawed through it. Then finally, they hit open water. Sunlight broke across the waves, and it felt for a second like peace. Shackleton lit a cigarette for Worsley, and the two sat, passing it back and forth in silence, just watching the horizon. Shackleton wasn't his usual unshakable self. 16 months of pressure had worn him thin. He told Worsley how hard it had been to split that party and how much he hated leaving the others behind. He admitted that he wasn't sure that this would even work. On land, he could lead people pretty easily. He could read people, he could manage morale, take calculated risks, but the ocean was different. For once, Shackleton wasn't in control. For 2 solid days, the wind screamed from the southwest, hammering the boat like a toy in a bathtub. Spray didn't just mist in over the sides, it came in sheets. Waves would hit the hull with such force that the entire boat flexed. Anything that wasn't tied down got flung around, including the people inside. The canvas canopy sagged with water, heavy, leaking. Everything was always wet, and the cockpit, the oars, the gear, even the biscuits were soggy, if they weren't frozen. There was no hiding from the cold. They were rotating through steering shifts, and whoever was up top got drenched. Whoever was below just stayed pretty damp. And their clothing was pretty hopeless for this kind of weather. They had layers of wool, oilskins, cracked boots, which were useless in these conditions. It was like being wrapped in a cold, wet towel that never dried. The wind cut straight through them, and there was no fire to warm up with. Just body heat and blubber grease. And sleep? There was no sleep. You didn't crawl into your sleeping bag so much as wedge yourself inside it after belly crawling over the rocks in the bottom in the pitch dark. The bow was the driest part of the boat, which meant it was crammed. But no one could lie flat. They had 6 sleeping bags, but Shackleton made them double up, using half for cushioning and the rest for warmth. And in theory it worked, but only if you could forget about the icy trickles running down your neck and the stench of unwashed men, grease, and mildew, which was thick in the air. And yet this was still the easy part. And then they hit the Drake Passage. It's a narrow gap between South America and Antarctica where the Pacific, Atlantic, and Southern Oceans all collide. There's no landmass to break up the flow of the wind or waves, so the storms just build and build, day after day. The winds whip around the globe with nothing to stop them, creating these massive swells and chaotic seas that can stretch for hundreds of miles. And the Drake is where the cold Antarctic air slams into warmer northern systems. It's unstable, violent, and unpredictable. The men were tossed around in the boat constantly. Waves weren't just high, they were relentless. There was no rhythm to the ocean either, no break, just wave after wave and storm after storm, and just trying to survive. On May 2nd, 8 days after they left Elephant Island, they were still alive, but barely. The leaks hadn't slowed, the ride wasn't as violent, but that's because everything above water was now entombed in ice, up to half an inch thick. The sea anchor rope was encased in ice and dangerously heavy. Inside the boat, water had almost frozen solid, and they couldn't even pump it out until they thawed it. Somehow they got the stove lit and chipped ice off the floor. They cleared just enough weight for the boat to rise out of the water again. And then the stench hit them. Something sickly sweet, rancid, foul even. And it was the reindeer sleeping bags rotting away. I mean, they'd been wet for how long? So they were slimy and literally decomposing around them. They scraped out what they could and dried what they could and cracked jokes about it to stay sane, because what else can you do, really? And then they lost the sea anchor. It was just one bad thing after another, and then all of a sudden the sun came out. Worsley was able to pull out his sextant and had a first chance at real positioning in days. All the men held their breath while he looked and did his calculations. And they were halfway to South Georgia. That sounds abysmally far to me. Still, hundreds of miles to go. But the 6 men crammed into that 22-foot boat were now ecstatic. By day 11, the boat was barely holding together. No one was sleeping. That night, during Shackleton's watch, a low roar began to rise above the wind. He wasn't sure what it was. At first it sounded kind of distant, and then it grew louder and faster. He looked up and saw it, a monster wave higher than anything they'd faced, racing straight at them. There was no time to shout, no time to brace. The carriage was yanked up the face of the wave and then slammed down hard. A wall of water tore across the deck and filled the boat. It buried the men in blackness. For a moment, no one even knew which way was up. But amazingly, they were still afloat. The boat was full of water, though, up to the seats, so they had to start bailing with everything they could. They were using pots, boots, their bare hands, just desperate to get the water out. And it took 2 hours to empty the boat. When it was over, they fired up that stove, drank their favorite concoction, warm milk, and sat in silence, shaking and exhausted, but again, somehow alive. Like, these guys were so freaking lucky. And finally, after 17 days of storms and nearly dying every second, they'd done the impossible. Crossed 1,300 kilometers or 800 miles of Antarctic Ocean in a 22-foot wooden boat and hit the exact island they were aiming for. Worsley had pulled off an amazing feat, landed them within a few miles of civilization on South Georgia Island. But they were on the opposite side of the island from where the whaling station was. And they couldn't even reach the island. Because these guys cannot seem to get even the smallest break, a hurricane was starting offshore. And that meant the coast was nothing but waves exploding against the cliffs and rocks. And there was nowhere to land. They spent a full day circling in freezing spray, desperate for a way in. And then finally, they saw it. A narrow inlet barely wider than the boat. And they had one shot. If they missed it, they'd be torn to pieces on the rocks. So they rode like hell. They surged forward on a rising swell, scraping through by inches and slammed onto a rocky beach. They had freaking made it. So they flipped the boat upside down, jammed it between rocks, patching holes with canvas and seaweed to create a crude shelter. Inside, they huddled in their wet clothes, eating blubber and biscuits. McNeish and Vincent could barely move, and McCarthy was just hanging on. Shackleton knew that, where they landed, no one was coming. Like, the whaling station would have had no idea that they were there, because they all thought the whole crew was dead by now. And their only option was to cross over land. But no one had ever crossed South Georgia Island before. It had steep terrain, it was glaciated and full of hidden crevasses. But it was their only chance. So on May 18th, Shackleton prepared to lead one final push, not across the sea, but through the heart of the island itself. By July, back at Elephant Island, the hut was so filthy that they brought in stones to cover the floor. No one mentions Shackleton and the crew that left 99 days earlier. It felt like speaking about them would kind of be a curse. Wild quietly started saving nails and wood and thought that if no rescue was coming, they'd have to try and build a boat themselves and reach Deception Island, an island much closer than South Georgia. But that was a toss-up because it sometimes had whalers, but it wasn't guaranteed. And whaling season was ending, so the odds were really bad. But each morning, Wild climbed the lookout rock and said, "Get your things ready, boys. The boss may come today." Every single day. And even when no one believed it, he thought that hope mattered, so he kept the hope alive. By August, the sea was still frozen. Food was running low, and the penguins were gone. By September, the ice began to shift. Every dark spot on the horizon made their heart race. Was it Shackleton? Or had the ocean taken them all? South Georgia's interior was a nightmare of rock and ice. There's towering peaks that cut through the clouds, separated by glaciers so steep that they look vertical. Crevasses were deep enough to swallow a house. Snowfields stretched for miles with no visible end. After one measly night of rest, Shackleton, Crean, and Worsley set out. They carried no tent, no sleeping bags, just a rope, a carpenter's tool to hack out steps in the ice, screws in their boots, and a compass. Barely enough for survival, let alone a mountain crossing. There was no map, they only had a coastline sketch of the island, so the entire interior of South Georgia was a blank space. Shackleton led the group, walking fast. The snow was soft and ankle deep, and their legs were already tiring before dawn. But they quickly covered 5 miles. I don't know where they got the energy, I guess just survival. There was a lot weighing on them, not only them surviving, but all the men on Elephant Island. They descended into a glacier only to realize that they'd gone the wrong way and there was no route down, so they had to turn all the way back and double back on their path. Later, they reached a high ridge and froze when they saw what was on the other side. The slope was way too steep to climb down, and there was no way to control a descent. If they tried to scramble down, they'd fall. Shackleton made the only call that he could. They'd have to slide back down the slope they just climbed up. It was also too dangerous to climb down that slope without proper gear. It was madness, but there was no other way to get down. They were kind of stuck. So they linked themselves together like a human toboggan, hugging onto each other. Just 3 men, tied by a rope, no idea what lay below. There could be hidden rocks or boulders that would kill them instantly. But they had to go, so they pushed off, and they rocketed downhill. Snow was blasting their faces, and speed was picking up. They had no control, no brakes, and then slam! They hit a snowbank. Not a rock, but just a snowbank. They looked at each other and burst into hysterical laughter. It was just insanity what they just did, but it worked. Like the luck that was on their side. It's just unreal. By now, the sky was darkening. Fog was rolling in over the ridges above them, and the weather here at South Georgia was notorious. The blizzards were kind of known as the worst on Earth, and these guys were racing the clock. And then it got worse, just when you think that they can't get any worse. Stacy, can it? They've already experienced almost every bad thing that they could. Well, no. It gets worse. They ended up going down the wrong glacier entirely, something they had already done once, but when you don't have any maps, they can't see very far, right? They don't know where they're going, so they're just kind of winging it. So they repeatedly had to climb back up sections that they scrambled down when they realized where they were. And finally, amazingly, their bodies were finally starting to break down. Their legs were seizing up, their bodies were locking up. At one point, they huddled together in a dip between ridges to rest and warm up. Shackleton caught himself nodding off, and he felt warm, almost peaceful. And that's when he realized he was drifting off and yanked himself up. He knew from his cold weather experience that if they fell asleep now, they would never wake up. He gave the others 5 minutes to sleep and then woke them up. And he lied and told them that they slept for half an hour. And it was just enough to get them moving again. At dawn, they crossed one last pass. And that's when Shackleton stopped dead in his tracks. He heard something. Faint, far away, but it was something. And it sounded like a whistle. It was 6:30 a.m., and he knew that if it was real and not just a hallucination, another would follow at 7 o'clock, and that was the whistle calling the whalers to work. So they waited, barely breathing, for half an hour, 6:58, 6:59, and then exactly on the hour, 7 o'clock, the second whistle blew. It had been an agonizing 17 months since they'd last heard the outside world. And you may think, well, great, they made it, but oh no. Let me tell you what happened next. They had one last obstacle. They reached this really steep icy slope, which was, again, too dangerous to descend directly. There was like sheer ice, there was no grip, a big drop, and which meant death if you slipped. But off to the side of this, they found this small meltwater stream, cutting down the kind of a more gradual path down the mountain. So they followed it, wading in knee-deep meltwater. It was freezing cold, but passable. And then the stream suddenly vanished. It dropped off the edge of a cliff, a 25-foot waterfall into nothing. And there was no way around it. They were stuck now. Then they did the only thing that they could. They tied the rope around them one by one and lowered themselves over the edge into the freaking waterfall. Shackleton hit the bottom, gasping for breath, soaked to the bone, and still freezing. And then the others followed. Then finally, through the haze, guess what? They reached the whaling station. There was no more obstacles. On this trek, anyways. 2 boys saw them at first and instantly turned around and ran screaming. These 3 human disasters had walked out of the mountain like ghosts and scared them. Then the foreman rushed out, stunned not just by their appearance, but by the direction from which they'd come. He led them to the station manager's office, and when the manager opened the door and saw who it was, because he'd met Shackleton years earlier, he simply wept. What Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean had done was unthinkable. When a British survey team retraced Shackleton's route in 1955, they came with ropes, maps, crampons, and proper mountaineering gear. And even they came down shaking their heads saying, we don't know how they did that. It was just unbelievable. Back at the whaling station, the 3 men were unrecognizable, salt-stained, hollow-eyed, and skeletal. They were handed clean clothes, hot food, and finally a bed. Could you just imagine what that would feel like after that long? Oh, it would be glorious. That evening, 4 old Norwegian sea captains walked in. They had no words, no introductions. They just walked right up to the men and shook their hands. They were the men who just did the impossible. And these sea captains were men who had spent their entire lives in Antarctic waters, and now they were standing in front of Shackleton paying respect. They understood exactly how unbelievable the whole story was. But there was no time to hang around. There were still 22 men stranded on Elephant Island, and the southern winter was closing in fast. Within 3 days, Shackleton was already on a rescue ship headed back. But the first vessel couldn't break through, and neither could the second. Or the third. He was pretty persistent. And one was damaged, one almost sank, and one didn't even make it to within sight of the island. Still, Shackleton refused to give up. Eventually, he convinced the Chilean Navy to loan him a little steam tug called the Yelcho. She had no heating, no radio, and wasn't built for the ice. Shackleton promised not to take her into the heavy pack ice, but he was lying. It had been 4 months and 6 days since Shackleton left Elephant Island. The 22 men, still stranded there, were down to survival basics again. They were boiling seaweed, gathering driftwood, running out of food, and trying not to talk about a possible rescue. Most had just accepted it quietly that Shackleton wasn't coming back. Then, someone spotted something on the horizon. It looked like a faint column of smoke. They watched it for a long time, not daring to hope, wondering if it was a hallucination or just wishful thinking. But then the shape grew, and it got bigger and bigger, and then they saw a dark hull, and then a bow cutting through the fog. A ship, a real ship. They were all pretty sure it was real, and then they saw the man himself, Shackleton, standing on deck. At first no one moved, it didn't feel real, but then the shouts came, and then the sprint to shore came. There was tears, hysterical laughter, men collapsing. Shackleton called out, "Are you all well?" And Wilde said, "Yes, we're all safe, all well." Not a single man had been lost from that expedition. Shackleton urged them to move fast because the sea could still turn on them at any moment. Could you imagine him getting stranded there again? I would just give up. But But no one hesitated. One by one, they scrambled into the boat, leaving behind everything they'd clung to for months. Their journals, their carved tools, the last scraps of who they were. They were going home, but not everyone would be so lucky. While the world celebrated Shackleton's return, most people didn't realize the Endurance expedition had a second team, stranded on the opposite side of Antarctica. And this was the Ross Sea Party. Their job was to land on the opposite coast and lay supplies for Shackleton's continental crossing. Of course, that never happened. But the Ross Sea Party didn't know that, so they just kept going. They faced blizzards, frostbites, scurvy, and starvation. 3 men died. And amazingly, the team completed their mission. They laid all the supplies that Shackleton needed. They did exactly what he asked of them, even as their teeth fell out and their skin peeled from vitamin deficiencies. After drifting helplessly for 9 months, the Aurora ship finally broke free of the ice in March 1916. The remaining crew, tired, half-starved, and operating a ship with a wrecked rudder and useless engine, somehow managed to rig enough repairs to sail her north. Nearly 2 months later, in early April, she limped into port in New Zealand, battered and barely seaworthy, but still afloat. When Shackleton learned what happened to the Ross Sea Party, he immediately began organizing a rescue. Incredibly, it would be aboard the very same ship, the Aurora, now patched up and seaworthy once again. But this mission would be even harder. The remaining men were over 2,000 miles away, stranded on the opposite side of the continent with no direct way to reach them. It took 4 long months, another brutal voyage, and a whole lot of luck, but Shackleton reached them, and for the second time in a year, he brought men back from the edge. In the months that followed, Shackleton returned to England a hero. The newspapers praised him, the Royal Geographic Society gave him medals. Most of the Endurance crew received the Polar Medal, Britain's honor for service in polar expeditions. But not all of them did. Shackleton refused to recommend 4 of his own men for the Polar Medal, which is brutal, considering what they all went through because of him. And that included Harry McNeish, the ship's carpenter. He was the one who did all the work on the ship on that last voyage that made the whole rescue possible. Shackleton never forgave him for questioning his orders after the Endurance sank, even though McNeish kept working and helped save lives. It was personal, and it was brutal. McNeish never got his medal. Despite his role in one of the most daring journeys in history, he did so much out there in terms of carpentry work that saved them and made it more comfortable, and he wasn't acknowledged by Shackleton for his work. McNeish ended up living out his final years in New Zealand sick and broke and quietly forgotten. 14 years after the Endurance expedition, he died alone. And the men of the Aurora, well, they got screwed too. Their mission was just as vital. Their suffering was just as brutal, if not worse, because they were out there longer. But the world barely noticed them. Their names didn't make the headlines. Their sacrifices were quietly erased. One of them later wrote, "We were the other side of the same coin, but no one ever remembers us." Their journals carry that quiet bitterness. They'd done exactly what was asked of them at enormous personal cost. And when they came home, no one seemed to care. Ernest Wild, who was Frank's brother, kept a diary during those long months. In it, he confessed that they felt abandoned. Others wrote of guilt, like they'd been sent to die for a goal that never even happened. When Shackleton finally reached them, he was stunned. He later wrote that if he had known what they were going through, he would have never attempted the crossing at all. But did he really mean it? Because if there's one thing that we know about Shackleton, it's that he couldn't stop himself. He was just obsessed with fame and legacy. He couldn't stop after everything he'd been through and everything that he'd seen. And then in 1921, he launched yet another expedition, because he couldn't stop, back to the Southern Ocean. And the goal of this one was kind of unclear. The crew was kind of a chaotic mix of old friends and new recruits, and Shackleton was older now, and he wasn't well. But the guy just couldn't sit still. Before they even made it to Antarctica, he had a massive heart attack and died aboard the ship, the Quest. He was 47. At his wife's request, he was buried on South Georgia Island just a few feet from the whaling station where he once staggered in, soaked to the bone, practically dead, and begging for help. Shackleton never crossed Antarctica. He kind of left a bit of a mess behind, at home, at sea. Some called him reckless, others called him a hero or a showman, just chasing headlines and fame. And his ambition got them into that mess. And after weeks buried in this story, I still don't know how I feel about Shackleton. In one way, he infuriates me. In another, he fascinates me. But it's also this incredible story of survival that you just can't deny how amazing it was. But he also did it just for fame and fortune. It wasn't because of a passion for Antarctica or exploring or learning and sharing with others. It was kind of self-centered. So I'd love to know what you think. Was Shackleton a reckless egomaniac who got lucky, or a brilliant leader when it mattered most? Let me know what you think in the comments. And thanks for watching.